After my husband's death, my mother-in-law demanded custody of my son. When I refused, he went missing, leading to her arrest for kidnapping. Hey, so I'm 32F and I've been an orphan all my life. I don't know much about my parents. Apparently, my mom abandoned me at a fire station when I was just a tiny baby. I don't even know when my real birthday is, and I've never tried to find out anything about my birth parents. My upbringing was pretty rough and non-traditional, to say the least. I spent my early years bouncing around from one orphanage to another without a family to call my own. Things took a turn when I hit 11, though. A couple, Mr. and Mrs. Williams, totally made up names, by the way, came to our orphanage looking to adopt. Somehow, they chose me. Mrs. Williams was super keen on adopting me. It took a while for the paperwork to go through, but eventually it did, and I thought my life was finally going to turn around. Leaving the orphanage and heading to what would be my new home was such a surreal experience. The Williams were well off, and at first, they seemed really kind. But Mrs. Williams had a strict side. She was obsessed with neatness and would always check if my room was tidy or if my hair was properly combed. If it wasn't up to her standards, she'd smack my hands. She always talked about this perfect image she had of her daughter, and I was supposed to live up to that. Mr. Williams, on the other hand, was odd. He'd accidentally walk into my room while I was changing. At 11, I believed his excuses, but as I got older, it happened more often, and it made me really uncomfortable. I asked Mrs. Williams if I could have a lock on my door, but she refused, saying all bedrooms needed to stay open and accessible. I tried telling her about Mr. Williams' weird behavior, but she brushed it off, thinking I was just trying to get my way. One night I woke up really thirsty and saw Mr. Williams standing in my doorway just staring at me. I screamed, and he ran out. Mrs. Williams came rushing in after hearing me scream, and I told her what happened. This time, she finally believed me. She was furious and went to confront him. The next day, she got a neighbor to install a lock on my door. I was finally able to feel somewhat safe, but she made me promise to only lock it at night or while changing, which I was more than happy to agree to. As a child, it was hard for me to understand what was so wrong with Mr. Williams' actions because no one had ever taught me about such things. I just knew how it made me feel. Unfortunately, he didn't really learn his lesson. Although he couldn't barge into my room anymore, he'd still ask me creepy questions whenever Mrs. Williams wasn't around. I started trusting my gut, and whenever Mrs. Williams went grocery shopping, I'd lock myself in my room or find an excuse to be out of the house, often hanging out with kids in the neighborhood. Spending time with them made me realize how different their lives were. They had parents who provided comfort and didn't make them feel uneasy. They had moms who checked in on them and brought them snacks. Even though I knew I should feel grateful that the Williams adopted me and provided a better life than the orphanage, I still longed for the kind of love and comfort other kids got so effortlessly. As I got older, I ended up hanging out with the wrong crowd in school. I wanted to be accepted so badly that I didn't care about my reputation. I got involved with drug addicts and kids who thought skipping school and not doing homework was cool. Looking back, I wish I could smack some sense into my younger self. But I guess everything happens for a reason. I regularly skipped classes, got into alcohol and drugs, and even went through a goth phase. Mr. and Mrs. Williams threatened to kick me out, but I was too rebellious to care. We had massive fights over it. Mr. Williams got even weirder about anyone I dated. He'd glare at them if they came to pick me up and would stay up until I got home. He'd shout at me if I wore a dress, telling me I looked like a tease and needed to change. He even made creepy comments about my hair, saying how it could excite boys if I left it down, so I should always tie it up in a ponytail. Initially, I kept quiet whenever he said stuff like that, but it was all just so messed up. I tried to brush it off, but it started to get under my skin more and more. I guess it pushed me to drink more just to drown out how unsafe and uncomfortable I felt in their house. One night, after an all-nighter at a party, I found myself on a bridge watching the most incredible sunrise. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, and it hit me hard. I just broke down crying. Looking back, it wasn't a super dramatic moment, but it made me realize I was being rebellious because I hated my life. I hated everyone and everything around me. If I kept going like that, I knew I'd end up like the other drunks and meth heads in my town. I had to get out, do something different. It didn't happen overnight, but I cut out the partying, hit the books, and focused on my grades. Yeah, I lost a lot of friends, but my grades got better, and Mr. and Mrs. Williams were pleased to see the change. But I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for me. When I finally graduated high school, it felt like I'd conquered a massive hurdle. My grades weren't exactly Stanford level, but they were good enough for a decent college. That's when Mr. and Mrs. Williams showed their true colors. They wouldn't let me apply to any colleges out of town. I was floored. These were the people pushing me to get good grades. During a heated argument, Mrs. Williams admitted they only adopted me to have someone grateful to them forever, someone to take care of them in their old age. Mr. Williams chimed in saying, "Kids are supposed to be caretakers, and it was the least I could do after all they'd spent on me." I was stunned. Mrs. Williams went further, bragging about keeping me safe from her husband and ensuring I was obedient and disciplined so I wouldn't leave. They even threatened to destroy my diploma and burn my clothes to trap me there. That night, terrified but determined, I gathered my important documents and some clothes. I slipped out the window without making a sound, leaving behind a note. I warned them that if they tried to come after me or involve the police, I'd expose Mr. Williams for all the creepy stuff he did to me over the years. I made it clear I wouldn't hesitate to tell my story, with no specific destination, just enough money for a bus ticket, and the knowledge that at 18 I was free from my adopted family. I headed to my friend Lorraine's place. She had moved to a nearby town, but we stayed in touch over the years. I arrived at her doorstep early in the morning, looking like a mess with my bag. Lorraine and her parents welcomed me with open arms. She was thrilled to see me, and her parents asked a few questions, but they didn't press too hard. It seemed like they knew I'd run away, but didn't push me for details. I asked if I could stay for a few days, and they agreed without hesitation. Staying at Lorraine's place, I finally felt safe. She let me sleep in her room, and we worked on college applications together every morning. In the evenings, we'd hang out with her friends, go hiking or swim in lakes. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. Her parents' kindness puzzled me, but years later, Lorraine told me that everyone in my hometown knew about Mr. Williams being a creep. He had a record, which I had no clue about. That explained why her parents were so understanding. I'll always be incredibly grateful to Lorraine and her parents for their passion and for giving me a safe place when I needed it most. Man, that summer was a wild ride, but so crucial I seriously don't know how I'd have made it without them. When I wrote that farewell letter to Mr. and Mrs. Williams, it must have done the trick, because they've never reached out to me since. Not once. Lorraine and I ended up getting into the same college, which was awesome. Her parents were super helpful and even helped us settle into our dorm. I remember being so pumped to see that I had my own bed and desk to decorate however I wanted. College was where I met James, the love of my life. From day one, our connection was intense. He was the sweetest guy I had ever met, and every conversation with him gave me butterflies. We started off as friends, but one night after a movie, he leaned in and kissed me out of nowhere when he dropped me back at my dorm. We both laughed and then stayed up all night just talking. It's still one of my favorite memories to this day. James knew all about my past and never once judged me for it. He was actually furious about how horrible my adopted family had been, but happy that I had cut ties with them for good. He shared a lot about his own family, too. His mom, Martha, was a single mom for a long time before she remarried. James lost his dad in a car accident when he was young, and Martha worked her butt off to pay the bills and ensure he got a good education. I totally understood why he admired her so much. I was impressed, too, by her strength and resilience. Eventually, Martha met Dean, who became James' stepdad. James said they had a good relationship, and overall, his home life seemed so much better than mine. As James and I got more serious, he decided it was time for me to meet his mom. Even though she visited the university pretty often, we'd never actually met, so he arranged for us to have dinner at a nearby restaurant. During dinner, I quickly realized Martha wasn't exactly thrilled about meeting me. She bombarded me with questions, particularly about my family and childhood. I felt like I had to share my experience of living in various orphanages before being adopted by the Williamses. Her lips pursed in disappointment as I told my story, making it clear she wasn't pleased at all. I tried to change the subject by asking about her work, but she kept insisting I reveal everything about my past. She didn't want any surprises later on, as she put it. She also made some pretty harsh comments about never expecting her son to date an orphan and how James could do much better. Her words stung, making me feel incredibly uncomfortable and unwelcome. James was visibly pissed and told her several times that her comments were inappropriate and unfair. But Martha just kept chiming in about how she only had his best interests at heart, saying, "Mommy knows best." The whole scene was super weird to me, but since I didn't grow up in a normal family, I figured maybe this was just how protective parents acted. James apologized to me after dinner and promised he'd talk to his mom about her behavior. Martha and I did meet a few more times after that, and she made an effort to comment less about my background. Dean, her husband, was always sweet and polite whenever we met, which was a huge relief. Despite Martha's disapproval, James and I kept going strong. We knew we wanted to spend the rest of our lives together. So when we graduated, it wasn't a surprise to anyone when James popped the question. We both had landed great jobs and were all set to move to San Francisco to start our new life. We threw an engagement party for our close friends and James's family before the big move, but Martha was not happy at all. She made her displeasure pretty obvious. At one point during the party, we were alone, and she couldn't hide her disdain anymore. She outright told me she never imagined her son would end up with someone like me, insinuating I was just a phase for him. Up until then, I'd always shown her respect, but that was the last straw. I firmly told her that she couldn't speak to me in such a disrespectful manner again. I reminded her that I wasn't just his girlfriend anymore. I was going to be his wife, her daughter-in-law. I told her I understood her disapproval, but emphasized that I genuinely loved her son and believed we were good for each other. I made it clear that my past wasn't my fault, but I was working hard to build a better future, and I hoped she could support that. She just scoffed and declared that I'd never have her blessing. Without missing a beat, I knew we had a long road ahead of us, but I was determined to make it work with James. So I calmly told her I never asked for them and just walked away. Later at the party, she whined to James about how rude I was, and my fiancé told her she deserved it because she was always mean to me. Watching her turn all red from embarrassment was pretty satisfying. Dean escorted her out while she was yelling at James and me for supposedly rushing into marriage and cursing us out. Honestly, apart from that drama, our court marriage went pretty smoothly. We moved to Cali and got ourselves a rental apartment. Sure, our work hours were long, but every night we'd make sure to spend as much time together as we could. I never thought marriage could be this easy, but I guess when you're with the right person, it just feels effortless. James and I talked a lot about our future and decided we'd only have kids once we were financially stable. So, in the 4th year of our marriage, after moving into our own place that we worked our butts off for, we finally decided to start trying for a baby. This house was the result of all our hard work, and we were beyond excited about the idea of welcoming a little one into our lives. Martha, on the other hand, barely visited us, even though Dean would call or text regularly. She clearly still had a grudge, but everything changed when I got pregnant. As soon as she found out, she called James, demanding G to move in with us for the final months of my pregnancy and insisted on being in the delivery room. Both James and I refused her demands. James even told her she was crazy for asking, which triggered another fight. Martha kept saying that grandparents should be involved in these things and that I was a bad mother for not allowing her to watch her grandchild's birth. Long story short, James handled his crazy mom, and she wasn't allowed to visit until our son was 5 weeks old. During this time, I was on maternity leave while James still worked, but he'd come home every night to do bath time with our son and put him to sleep. We were both exhausted, but being parents brought us so much joy. All the love and attention I missed out on as a child made me want to be the best mother I could be, and I thought I was doing pretty well. However, when Martha visited, she had complaints about everything. From why I was still breastfeeding, why the baby slept in the nursery instead of with me, to why I didn't dress my son a certain way. Honestly, it was just petty stuff. She insisted on staying with us for a few weeks, and those weeks were absolute hell. She argued with me about everything, and even wanted to install a baby cam to keep tabs on the baby. I was exhausted and didn't have the energy to argue much. Things got worse when Martha did nothing to help around the house. She wouldn't even wash a dish or fold laundry. If I asked her for help, she'd loudly exclaim that no one helped her when she was raising James, and that I needed to manage everything on my own. Her presence was a burden. Not only did I have another mouth to feed, but she also criticized my cooking, saying one or two dishes weren't enough for her son. I finally had enough and told James. He kicked her out the next day, which deeply offended her. She yelled about deserving time with her grandson and that we couldn't keep her away. James pointed out that she didn't lift a finger to help, which is what family does when visiting new parents. Martha then accused me of being a lousy mother and said she wanted to teach me a lesson. So James kicked her out, despite her protests. After Dean picked her up, she sent me numerous nasty texts, blaming me for the family's discord and even wishing I had died during childbirth. Her hatred was so strong that James and I decided to cut her off completely. We let Dean know, and surprisingly, he understood. We haven't been in touch with my MIL for the past 4 months, and I thought it would stay that way. But then my life turned upside down when I got a call from the hospital saying James had been in a bike accident. At first, my brain just froze. I remember that day like it was yesterday. When I got the call about James, I just refused to believe it. I collapsed onto the floor, clutching my son, feeling my whole body go numb. I knew I had to get to the hospital, so I called a coworker to come over and watch my son, and thank goodness she agreed. I can't even begin to describe how I felt when I saw my husband's lifeless body in the morgue, but I fainted from the sheer heartbreak. The most painful call I had to make after identifying his body was to Martha, to tell her about her son's death. Her blood-curdling cries still haunt me. After the news broke, my friends and James's relatives rushed over to California to be there for me and my son. We had to organize a funeral, and thankfully, my friends took charge because I was in no state to handle anything. We agreed to step out into the backyard, and initially, Martha expressed her condolences. She told me she understood the pain of losing a husband and wished I didn't have to go through such grief. But then, out of nowhere, her tone changed. She suggested I wasn't in the right frame of mind to care for my son and proposed that she take him to raise him away from all the sadness and depression. I was absolutely red. I just stared at her in disbelief as she went on, saying that if I were a good mother, I shouldn't be selfish and hold on to her grandson during such a difficult time. Something in me snapped. Years of pent-up anger and resentment just came bursting out, and I screamed at her to get out of my house. My voice was so loud that guests inside turned their heads in concern. My friends rushed to my side, and as I told them about Martha's outrageous demand, they looked at her with a mix of horror and disgust. Martha started yelling back at me, but my friends stepped in, firmly escorting her out of the house. They said her behavior was far from normal and advised her to seek professional help. When others found out, they agreed Martha might be having a mental breakdown after losing her son, and that I should ignore her demands. They insisted I shouldn't let her in anymore, especially since the house was now mine. That night, I kissed my son goodnight and went to bed, still reeling from the grief and shock. Imagine my horror when I woke up the next morning to find my son missing from his crib. I called the police, frantically searching the house. When officers arrived and asked if anyone else had access to our house key, it clicked this had to be Martha's doing. She was the only one with our spare key, which we had given her years ago for emergencies. I told the officers about the previous day's disturbing encounter and her shocking demand. They wasted no time dispatching a team to Martha's house. To my immense relief, they found my son there, unharmed. Martha was swiftly charged and arrested for kidnapping and trespassing. She kept insisting to the officers that it was just a prank and that she had every right to spend time with her grandson. As you can imagine, this news spread like wildfire. Friends and family who know me have been calling in shock. Most people agree. It was right to press charges, but some of Martha's relatives and her husband, Dean, believe that Martha is going through a tough time and that I should let it slide. Dean even promised to admit her to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. So, Reddit, am I the asshole for filing charges against my mother-in-law for taking my son? Should I let it slide because she's grieving in her way? Update 1. I'm glad most people think I shouldn't forgive her and that she might not back down from this incident. I felt a bit guilty initially, but I agree with what most comments said, that even my husband James would have supported my decision to charge her. That's exactly what I fear and why I have no choice but to pursue this. I don't want to punish her, but she needs to learn the consequences of her actions, or she might do it again to me and my son. As for those relatives who think I should let it slide, I've decided to ignore them and even block them. They didn't go through the horror I did when I woke up to find my son missing. I'm currently working on hiring a lawyer to help fight this case and present my side effectively to a judge. I'll update soon. Update 2. Hey everyone, I wanted to give you an update on the crazy situation with my MIL, Martha. So, after taking everyone's advice, I went ahead and changed all the locks in my house. I also installed cameras at the front door and in the backyard, just to be extra safe. And thankfully, I found a great lawyer who helped me and my son get a lifetime restraining order against Martha, so she can never come near us again. Honestly, doing all these things has made me feel a lot more secure and less anxious. My lawyer is pretty confident we're going to win this case since the facts are super clear, but I've still been really anxious about the whole thing. I promise to update you guys as soon as there's more news on the case. Okay, update 3. As promised, I finally have some news to share about the case against Martha, who, as you know, tried to kidnap my son. The past 7 months have been absolute